Oh, sailor, have you found your perfect sea?
In the last talk that I gave, I talked about social formation, and the point of that was to emphasize the division of labor and the way in which authority, opportunity, which is what we moderns often focus upon is opportunity, are distributed through the complexity of social arrangements for social reproduction. The reason I'm pausing there on social reproduction, we can get that, is because it's also a production. It's not every reproduction is also a slight adaptation and transformation. We are invariably, constantly through our participation in reality, making these micro transformations that we often become oblivious to because we've got used to certain ways of doing things in authority structures, and after a while we find that we've accumulated all these tensions that are coming out of the processes of our engagement in the world that lead to these social explosions. And it is about this social explosion that I really am talking about today when I'm talking about equality, which is the topic of this talk, equality. You might be familiar, in fact you will be familiar, with these two symbols. And this one, most people, including myself, react to that with a certain, what's the word I'm looking for, a certain horror. Or not even horror, just disgust or distaste. It stands for a movement which did a lot of damage, terrible damage, horrific. You can use all the moral terms you want, but they were basically, it was a symbol of a group of people that were sure that they could fix up the world if they had just got rid of the Jews, and then they got rid of the Slavs, and then they ruled the world a certain way and they followed the Führer. I mean, it was just ridiculous. The only thing that can be said in its favour, if favour it is it's so stupid. How could anyone believe it? How could anyone take it seriously? And yet people did take it seriously, because people are capable of taking the most ridiculous things seriously. Now, this one engenders a certain disgust, I would say, in most people. There are some lunatics running around there thinking, oh, that was a great idea and Hitler was a great man and blah, blah, blah. Now this one, the hammer and sickle, this one not only had a lot more support going for it for a long time, until the whole thing just fell apart, that is, the Soviet Union fell apart. And even though China still used this symbol in its symbiology, the thing about China is, how communist is it really? It's Leninist in its party structure, but it's not really communist in towards any of the end of it that it's seeking. Okay, but this symbol amongst intellectuals doesn't quite have the same revulsion aspect to it as this. And I find that really something that you would have to say is indicative of really bad thinking by our elites. But it's because in its way that this symbol was a symbol that was generated primarily by an educated elite. To put it bluntly, the educated elite had much more to do with creating communism than they do with National Socialism. In National Socialism, the educated elite is a relatively smaller component. And it's not, and part of the difference is that theoretically, National Socialism is not very well developed. It's using race theory, I suppose, if you even want to call it a theory, but race claims, whereas communism is based upon political economy, I think very badly done, but nevertheless, it's something that really fueled the interests of and generated an entire industry, even a publishing industry, of intellectual academics who would make a living of advancing this program. And one forgets how popular, most people have forgotten how popular Joseph Stalin was amongst Western academics. And of course that sign, the Soviets used that sign.
Just lower it a bit, sorry. Just lower it a bit so I can see your face, because I can see your eyes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
I just want to get that. Okay, so
That's fine.
we can sort that out. So this, in a sense, had a lot more intellectual credibility, and so many major intellectuals of the 20th century were very sympathetic to and supportive of the Russian Revolution. But the point I want to make is that this actually did far more damage than this, in terms of the sheer scale. Now, there's many ways to look at these things, and sheer scale is not the only way. But one of the interesting things is that the ideas of National Socialism were so obviously directed towards benefiting one group at the expense of another that it was very difficult for the National Socialists in the long run to keep gaining support, because it was nationalist as well as socialist, and nationalism meant in this case that your nation is going to be taking on all these other nations. So they decided to take on pretty much everybody else except a few allies that they could get into the game with them. But even people that had sorts similar terrible things, they found themselves in opposition to. But which is not that different in some ways from this lot, in that they would start turning against each other. But in the main, intellectuals were far more, what's the word I'm looking for? Far more willing to make compromises with, or accept, or see the positive of what the communists were doing. In fact, a common statement is, well, they went wrong, but had it not been for Stalin, then it might have all worked out right. Or maybe the Bolsheviks weren't that great, but had the Mensheviks won, it would have been good. Or something. This kind of nonsense. It's just ahistorical rubbish. In fact, this lot, because the idea is so far more endearing in a way, so able to tap into certain sentiments and habits of a much greater number of people, it was able to do that much more damage. This was, in a sense, there's limitation in the damage it could do. Terrible stuff, but limitation in the damage. There's damage limitation simply because the doctrine itself doesn't want to be universalistic, whereas this wants to be universalistic. But nevertheless, with the downfall of communism in the main, outside of the academy, unfortunately, many people would say this was a disaster, that was a disaster, they were terrible things. Now, this third symbol, you look at that and you don't get a sense of a social symbol. What you see is, even though it's badly drawn and not perfect, but you're far from perfect, what you're seeing is a mathematical symbol. That is a mathematical symbol. But in some ways, I would say that maybe this has done the most damage of all these. Because in some ways, it's tacitly in this. It is certainly become part of the way of speaking. It's not presented in that symbolic way. I've used that symbol to address the fact that there's a kind of shock in seeing it like that. You think that's got nothing to do with society. It seems wrong to think of this as kind of a social symbol, and yet so many people today are very happy to mount social critique on the basis of something being unequal, which suggests they're appealing to equality, which this is a symbol of, even though they would not usually care about showing that symbol. And given where we are in the West, and this is a longer story, I've alluded to it, and at some time I'll address it more directly, but I think, in fact, that where we are living at now is a kind of corporate, socialistic, globalist elite that has a lot in common with the fascists and with the communists, but a lot in common with the fascists, even though they're not militaristic, but the way in which they want to not only control the state, but integrate the state and the corporate world and rule and direct social behaviour so that you I think I've said this before, but you basically have leadership structures all throughout the society, and you are cultivating leaders who will direct people into the kind of formations which are seen by this elite as being permissible and desirable. That, I think, is what fascism does, and communism did that too. And by the way, communism learned a lot from fascism, and fascism from communism. Another thing these two kinds of regimes had in common is that in their claims to be able to fix up the social economic ailments of the world, both of them resorted to slave labour. Both of them used labour camps as an aspect of their social and economic reproduction. I just mentioned that in that it's far from obvious that that will not happen again. So, but equality seems so innocuous. It seems so, not only innocuous, it seems to be a good thing. And in a certain way, with certain limitations and constraints, if we look at its development socially, there are times when it's been a very good thing, and I would not deny this. If I go back to the ancient Greeks, where we have the world's first democracy, we see that Plato and Aristophanes, in different ways, both of them are quite critical, are aware of the tendencies within democracy to make it more egalitarian, which are very destructive. And Aristophanes makes fun of this in the Assembly of Women, and Plato does a critique of this in a number of places, but the most obvious place is the Republic. And they, I think, recognise the dangers that come from wanting to make a political body in which classes of people, types of people, are not really the same, treated as if they were exactly the same, equality. And in the case of Plato, he recognises that if that is modulated by the state and a certain degree of intelligence within the state and a certain kind of aristocratic presence within the state, and by aristocratic he means the most gifted, the most cultivated, the better educated, then that can work. That can work up to a point. If what you're wanting is a kind of input into politics which is not completely driven solely by this principle. So Plato believed democracy, when it is with law, is a reasonably good system. It's not his favourite, but when it comes to practicalities, and Aristotle does something very similar, they realise that there's certain value in this. Now, another way I think that one can see equality in a less obviously abstract way than how it's being used when someone says, I just want something because I should have because I'm equal to so and so, is through the idea of impartiality. And I raise that because when we want justice, we want a judge to be impartial. And one formulation of that kind of impartiality is equality before the law. We want equality before the law. Now, equality before the law, in this sense, is really only focusing upon something in a very restricted way. It simply means you want to be treated without favour or prejudice. You do not want something extraneous, like your birth or background, to come into the judicial process. Well, I started to hesitate then, because in all sorts of ways the background might be absolutely necessary for distributing impartial justice, because the judge might take into account, or might have to take into account, what has led you to perform a certain action, and that starts to complicate this idea of blind justice, because on the one hand you want justice to be fair, but on the other hand you need to know what's going on. and certain information which deals with, for example, what you may have suffered in your life is going to be relevant. It may not be decisive, but it might be relevant. For example, it might be a mitigating factor in the sentencing. And we have just come to widely accept this practice, and I think there's reasons for that. But I think the reasons for that lead you to move out beyond simply saying if something is equal or not equal. That in and of itself, there's not enough information in the idea of equality. It's a very stark. That sign is a really minimalist sign. It applies to mathematical entities in the first instance. It applies to things that in some way are really identical. And that is the problem when we take a concept, a value, which has a certain function within a certain process or engagement with the world. Doing mathematics is one kind of engagement. We do it for all sorts of reasons that also have application as well as logical development, etc. But taking that, transposing that into our vocabulary about our social existence, that becomes fraught with problems, because it's very easy to say this is unequal, this is unfair. And in fact, the major revolutions of modernity, and I'm thinking of the French and Russian revolutions, the inequality motif, somewhat deployed in different ways in those two revolutions, but you can see them in operation in the rhetoric that's used to critique the existing power structures. They become pertinent to the galvanizing of different groups seeking power and overthrowing the other groups that have had power. And of course, in neither cases did you get anything really like equality. And in fact, with the French Revolution, one of the things that comes out of that is socialism begins to grow as a kind of byproduct of the failure of that revolution to deliver the aspirations that were embedded in the rhetoric of those driving the revolution. But it was very clear, even had the revolution not completely broken down and there been a restoration, but it was very clear that it could not deliver equality, fraternity, what's the third one? Equality, fraternity, and liberty, equality, and fraternity. That each of those, they've really lovely rhetorical formulations, but each of them, is, if you've got any philosophical mind, just start digging away at them and you say, well, they don't actually say very much at all. They're just a word, and you need to look more closely at where you're going with these things. And if you're looking at the way a society forms, its division of labour, the different roles that are required to perpetuate a society, the different responsibilities that are required, words like that just aren't going to get you very far. But insofar as that triad of concepts became a spearhead for the aspirations of a group seeking power to overthrow another group that had power and had a whole lot of responsibilities, but which had, just touching on what I said last time, but it had faded in a sense. Its role had faded because the new reality, through all those transformations that were going on a daily basis, eventually meant that he had a lot of people with authority who there was no symbiosis left in the relationship, or there's very little. So they're just seen as dead wood. You're just seen as, and if you're a taxpayer, you're just seen, I'm just throwing money down the hole to this lot of people who are just a waste of space. And then you have another group saying, well, what we want is liberty, equality, fraternity, and what we want is society to look like this, and blah, blah, blah. And then you start to see how it all tears itself apart, because they're using a lot of abstractions to try and map out a plan of what the society should be like. But when it comes to the actual daily operations, They don't fit into that kind of plan. They don't fit into a schema of such simplicity. You still are going to have elites. You still are going to have authority. You're still going to have different division of labour. You're still going to have different responsibilities. You need someone to do this and someone to do that and someone to do this. And then you need someone to authorise who does what. You need someone to punish someone who does. And you start to see it's very complicated. And inequality is bred everywhere. It's impossible. And I want to be very clear here. Insofar as these talks are extremely critical of our contemporary global elite, extremely critical. This is one of the prompts for this series of talks. I also recognise, one, that some elite is going to be necessary, and two, I in no way, shape or form have any nostalgia for any of the past elites. We are in the world we are now. And a whole lot of things have got us to this. But one thing that is very operative in the narratives of dealing with our problems, and it is a narrative that really suits our present elites, is this word equality. And it's a very problematic word. And it's a problematic word because ultimately unreal things don't become more real simply by someone saying this should equal that. And what we see is that there are constant appeals to the obvious inequalities of things, some of which we may want to do something about, but not because it's unequal in and of itself, but because of the consequences of the way in which a certain group make their money or get their power may be really bad. And you can see that. And it's very interesting that people with enormous amount of power are very happy to fund projects and programs in which the appeal to equality is one of the pivotal moments within the narrative. And you should think, isn't there something wrong with that? If I've got a George Soros or a Bill Gates or any of these people, Mark Zuckerberg, pouring money into something and people talking about equality, shouldn't you smell a rat? Shouldn't you see, come on, they're not really serious. If they walk away from everything and distribute it, I might listen to them. But if they're not doing that, you'd think, well, somehow or other, this narrative suits their interests. And it's fair enough that they have an interest, and how exactly to deal with their interests is very complicated. And I don't say I have any easy solution to it, but someone who says, oh, socialism would take care of that, well, you'd have to say, well, yeah, but you're going to have, as you did have, and you inevitably will have, you're still going to have an elite. You're still going to have people distributing, directing where resources, and especially in something like socialism, they will direct how resources are made, which resources are made, and who will get them, and how they will be distributed. That's a hell of a lot of power. And this is why I cannot take socialism as anything other than a word particularly seriously, because as long as it's operating as an ideological phrase, it can create certain emotions in people, but it doesn't actually tell you anything. And that's why when people say, oh, you know, the theory is good, but the practice, we need to get back to the theory. Don't be an idiot. The theory is just the words you're using, and if you use your brain a bit more, you'll see what the practice is the way is the way in which an idea is played out. So the playing out of that idea is its reality. That's when you can judge it. You can't judge it on the basis of any internal consistency. That's ridiculous. Well, you can do it, but you know, if you were living in a world of the mind solely, well, good on you. Have fun doing that. And you can have your nice little, your nice little boxes of these are the good ones, these are the bad ones. But that's got nothing to do with anything other than your mental masturbation. That's all it is. So when we hear people speaking about equality in today's world, we need to ask, well, what exactly are they speaking about? For example, one phrase, and this is very interesting, the way in which a kind of morality is set up by an elite group, and then eventually it may come into play into the law. And I'm thinking of the example of the way in which people have increasingly in the last 15 to 20 years, and even more so in the last 5 years, and journalists are playing their role in this as well as academics, increasingly want to view human relationships of a sexual kind in terms of the equality of the power relationships, which is astonishingly stupid and seems to be so obvious to the people that say this. They seem to say it. If someone's older or a male, they will ipso facto have more power than someone youthful or who doesn't have much money. Well, money is not the only source of power. Beauty can be a source of power. Anything can be a source of power. But what is most interesting about this is the way in which our society is obsessed with stuff and power. And it's a sickness. It's an absolute, spiritually, it's a complete and utter sickness. That if you had had more power, you would have a better life. Power over what? To do what? This is the kind of thing that Plato criticised when he criticised the tyrants and the aspirations of the tyrant and the life of the tyrant. In fact, this is where we've got now in the year 2021, is our elite universities and schools and teach the way the world can be fixed is to make all of us a little tyrant by equalising the tyranny. I find it shocking, and it cannot come to a good end. It simply cannot come to a good end. And it won't come to a good end. Because that's not the way life is. Life will require you to do and give and take, and just having stuff is not going to make you or the world any better, and equalising what you have does not make you or the world any better. Now, I've said that equality is a major trope in the kind of narratives that are in circulation that are part of our education system, and so they're part of the mechanisms of selection of who will be in our elite. So if someone comes right out and says, look, I think equality is rubbish, and I think equality between the races or the sexes or this or that is rubbish, there's no way they're going to make it into the elite. Now, I would not ever talk about the races or the sexes or anything else in terms of equality. I find it completely unhelpful and unequal, equal. What's it mean? If you're talking about should the law be impartial in dealing with people in these situations, I'd say absolutely. We made an advancement, a kind of evolutionary advancement, you could say, within certain nations, not everywhere, within the way in which justice would be thought about and distributed and acted upon. And I think that's a very good thing. And I think impartiality is really important. I don't think someone should be able to, and when I say I think I'm just going along with a widespread consensus, and it's in the practice of the system. But there's all sorts of ways around this which I think are deeply disturbing. But even more disturbing is a way that term has been taken out of something that is genuinely valuable and real and transposed into an environment in which it serves a rhetorical function to create tremendous discord by deploying the mythology that the relationships between humans should be primarily calculated on the basis of power and resources available to them. It's a very, as I said, a very unfortunate and sad thing, and it ultimately is probably going to destroy Western civilization. That's how bad I think it is. Now, I want to roll back a bit, because I am not saying that markets are ipso facto bad things. Now, how do I get there, to markets? Well, one of the things about Western civilization, in the liberal wing of it that was been so successful, was that markets have played a very, very big part. And in fact, markets are part of a global network now, global reality. Now, the thing about the market I want to point out is that a market, any kind of market transaction is a signal of value. And in that signal of value, that is, I choose you by buying this. I choose this butcher by buying this meat. Even if it's not very conscious. Even if I'm just wandering around and that butcher happens to be there and I don't bother going over to somewhere 500 yards down the road because it's a bit too far to work. It's just turned up. It's rather haphazard, but I've got my $20 in the pocket. I want to get some meat. I go in there and I get that. And that transaction, I have shown my esteem, the value I place upon their presence under these circumstances for me to get that. And every transaction I am engaging with, and everybody with any money they have they're engaging with, is really a signal of value, of valuation. And in that signal of valuation, you can see very quickly that it's got nothing, not only does it have nothing to do with equality, but it is generating inequality. It must generate inequality. It's not the kind of process where equality could be generated. So when people want to criticize societies in which capitalism functions for being unequal, sure, of course it would be. The question is, what would the alternative be? And don't give us some nonsense about, well, we could have all these, people making decisions, and that's just silly. And that is silly. People sit round and decide what we're going to produce and how many would be produced. And no, we know what the alternative was, and that's if an alternative in which that would not function at all would be a central command system. And in fact, it would still function because inevitably, we know from experience, people would still be looking for ways to get round the law, to get what they wanted that wasn't in the system because there would be shortages, etc. We know all this. Anyone who doesn't know this, please just go off and read it if you doubt this. It's all out there. There's no need to waste the time talking about that. But the point I'm simply making is that a market is simply, the whole field of economic endeavour is simply the modality within which a certain kind of orchestration and generation of human action occurs. Orchestration of human energy. That just occurs because people are valuing things and other people wanting resources realise that if they provide this, then they can get that, and then they go out. And then within that, the law will also come into play. So please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting for a moment that this market system can function without the law or the state, and that the world would be all good if we only had this, like the libertarian argument. I think this is silly. It's complicated, but it's an aspect of organising human action, and it's a way in which people value without consciously even thinking about it. They're just doing it. I mean, I might salivate over buying a new guitar. You can see my guitars here. I love guitars. I'm a guitar nut. And I, salivate over that. That's very conscious. I want this and I value this and I calculate in my head and blah, blah, blah. And there's a lot of that goes on, but a hell of a lot of it is just I'm going to buy bread, I'm going to buy apples, I'll go to where I go. But every one of these commodities and every producer of these commodities or reseller of these commodities is really vying with another to get resources, and from me and from you and from everybody else. And what that is doing is showing some things go very big and some things stay small, some things go broke, there's movement going on, and it's a movement going on, it's a circulation of value in which inequality plays no role. You might say once you get to a certain scale, that doesn't mean there's no common features. There's certain common features between supermarkets, certain things they may have to do, or between smaller stores, etc. Yes, of course, there's common features, but equality is not about a common feature. At least not in the way it's usually used, and this is exactly why I see it as a problem. It's often taken as certain features are common enough that we can now invoke this abstraction in order to get exactly what we want. Now, this example of the market I've given you is indicating that so much of what we're doing is not that conscious. So when we're looking at the social world, we've got to take into effect that there's a conscious component and the component that's done, but if you like, a more obscure kind of consciousness there. It's just, you're doing it, but you haven't put that much thought into it and the consequences about it. Okay. So there you've got markets. Now, if markets are generating inequality, and we can see that, as producers become more and more successful, there can be a tendency to monopoly. They can introduce all sorts of terrible things to get rid of their opponents, and they will inevitably, where they can, use the state to help them, because the state is another modality of human organisation. And at some point, the economic and the political certainly entwine with each other, because the political is also bound up with the legislative. You can't have property without property rights and property laws and lawyers, and all of this goes around. So here you have this field, if you like, generating all this inequality, which goes from right up to the global capitalists I was mentioning before. They are very successful. Jeff Bezos has something created something that's extremely successful. Steve Jobs created something, Soros, different kind of creature, but so not all of them are producing stuff, but they can create things that are very successful, and as they're successful, we see this great power, and we see, that they own so much, in the poorest section of the world, maybe billions of people own, just a slither of what they own, which is indicating in and of itself there may be a problem here, especially if the decisions from that group also spill over into the political, which they do, and these then favour them and keep this situation. Not good, especially where poverty is generated. There's another argument altogether whether the creation of wealth is also what leads to the creation of poverty. I think that's a very different argument. And I don't think that's necessarily, it can be the case, but it doesn't have to be the case. And probably in most cases that's not really the case. But of inequality, yes, that is the case. But I've just said, inequality in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It depends what transpires with that. And then you've got to take into account, okay, how much inequality are we going to have? And again, it's not the kind of thing I think should be treated as if it's axiomatic, because it's not, I'll come back to it, it's not a mathematical puzzle. You have to study, and unfortunately political science is not widely studied. There's disciplines, people call themselves political scientists, and it's taught as a subject, but it's not really taught because they're not doing real political science. Political science would get you to really investigate the different interests involved, and it wouldn't be there just coming up with some moral solution to this, because that doesn't help anyone or do anything. In fact, I think these kind of moral solutions create more and just a whole other set of problems, and as I've indicated, I think one of the biggest problems they've created is to help cultivate an elite that I think is completely useless because it's not very well educated. It just deals in abstractions and makes false promises of how it'll fix these things. And of course, it doesn't do it, and what it does is they just get bought off, and so they work with the very richest people to do their bidding. I find it absolutely disgusting. So I do have a moral bone in my body, I find that irksome. But if what you have to, given this inequality, and given the scale it can take, and given at a certain scale this can generate a whole set of other problems, which I don't think, and although I've used the term inequality, I don't think talking about inequality is really the way to address these particular problems. I think you need to talk about each problem on its own merit and the processes that have fueled that, and then the consequences that come from that. Because on the one hand, for example, having monopolistic or quasi-monopolistic producers can concentrate resources in a way that does pay off for the consumer. And we know this, what Apple have done, what Microsoft have done, the consumer has benefited. But they have then gone on and done other things which are diabolical. So that then requires the state. And it's really, when we talk about wanting a more equal society, it doesn't matter who they are, and forget the anarchist jokesters, because it is a joke, that theory, because it's dependent upon human beings all thinking and being a certain way, which there's no reason on earth to believe that they are. And the people that believe that, usually, I've met them in universities, and when I was very young, I didn't think this was as stupid as I now think it is. I think it's totally stupid. It requires that everybody thinks and acts alike. Well, that's, what good is a theory that requires that? It just goes to show that it's not very well thought through. And it was an idea that was generated in opposition to systems that are definitely flawed. They are definitely flawed. Every system we have is definitely flawed. This is what we've got to deal with, and why so many of my objections to so many people who talk about politics is they keep dreaming up flawless systems. That's ridiculous. What we have is flawed systems, and we're going to have flawed solutions, in part because none of us are very capable. I've said this before. Our information is flawed and our capacities are flawed. If we understood this, then we could go to work one problem at a time, or obviously different groups working on one problem at a time, and through trial and error make some advances, but realise that our solutions also generate new problems, and we'd have to deal with that. But if we want to mitigate against the way in which resource accumulation goes in such an unequal capacity within the market that it creates opportunities for those with so many more resources to do things which are really bad, to do terrible things, to control people in ways which are terrible, then we need something strong to mitigate against it, and that's, of course, is the state. Now, the modern economy and the modern state develop together. They really grow up together. I mean, you can't have a modern economy without, I said property law, but tort law, a whole set of contract law, all these components which ultimately not only require lawyers, but states making decisions about which laws are made. So the state, now, unlike the market, the state is a way of orchestrating human action. But the kind of action that it can orchestrate is quite different from the market. Now, I'll qualify that immediately and say states can get in the business of producing things. And they can do it in one or two ways. They can do it as another player in a market system. That is, there can be markets in which they play a part. Or they can eliminate the market and become the sole occupier, which is what central planning systems attempted to do. And what we know is that it's not a great way to do economic action. Why? Why is the state not a great way to do? In some things it can do. It can say you have to do this. We must put a bridge over there. Public works. We need these public works. We will school people. We will orchestrate people into doing that. So it does a lot of stuff. But what it will not do that well. No, let me rephrase that. It's limited in the incentives that it can create. See, people like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, the incentive was they can become wealthy beyond any dream. Now, although within the state, the elite will garner resources to itself, and it can decide to give a certain amount of resources to so and so. What the state cannot guarantee is that it has the most efficient way of producing something, that it's got the best way, and come back to, because it's rather limited in the kind of energies it's able to harness and the kind of incentives that it gives. We'll recall originally the Bolsheviks wanted to have no money, and they realised very quickly they couldn't do that they needed to provide incentives, and that one of the reasons that Stalin got rid of the old guard was he wanted to make sure that the new elite would not be handicapped by the presence of that old elite there. But he didn't have a market economy, so the resources were relatively limited. And it comes back to a state can simulate a market, but it is not a market. It can operate within a market, but then it has to play by market rules. Or what it does, I see this in the universities, which are, completely so terrible in the way they use taxpayers' money, is they're able to employ people who act as if they're business leaders when they couldn't run a chook raffle. They couldn't do anything. But they have all this state money behind them, so they can't really mess up that much. They can mess up, but it doesn't matter. And of course, businesses will want to do this, don't get me wrong. Wherever there's a pot of money, you'll want to get hold of that to minimise your risk. That's not very understandable. So I'm not idealising markets or demonising states. They each have their own problems. I'm simply pointing out that markets, ipso facto, generate inequality. States are the only thing that we really have to try and modulate that inequality, and they come with another set of problems. The obvious one being the information at its disposal, which is, again, why planned economies just didn't work very well. Limited information, because in the marketplace you generate information by your new actions. So you're not only processing it but generating it, and you can do it in a far more flexible way. Obviously there's economies of scale, and the larger the enterprise gets, the more it'll want to monopolise, the more it'll want to act upon plans and schemas, and the more managers it brings in, the more it'll want security and all of these things. So there is a point in which it really blurs, and that's in part because it becomes so entangled in a political morass. But I come back to, in and of itself, that process is an elite process, as is what the state is. They're both elite processes. And not surprisingly, the elites from one group will seek out the elites from another group and want to influence each other, which is exactly what they do. That's why a Tony Blair, it doesn't matter who they are, they're all the same really, especially if they maintain favour with those elites, and if they don't, then those elites will turn against them with great viciousness. And we've seen various examples of this. And when they turn against them with great viciousness, we really see that these political positions are relatively secondary to the corporate players and the money they're able to deploy, but not simply within the enterprise they're doing. They're able to take it outside that enterprise and pay people in think tanks, in universities and other politicians to do their bidding. So, what I'm suggesting here is that in and of itself, the concept of equality is not going to get us very far with dealing with the kind of problems that it is frequently invoked to address. One being capital, concentrations of capital. That's and Marxism, even though Marx himself was very critical of the concept of equality because he saw it just as a bourgeois term, the whole enterprise that he comes up with is really just an attempt to create a more egalitarian society. And the consequences of that is he ended up with a slave labour camp. Well, he didn't end up with it, but that kind of society that he envisaged when there was an attempt to instantiate it, you see, it was actually created by an intelligentsia, and then they formed a party, and then they used the working class to help them, but most of the working class did not benefit at all from that. Not much at all from that. And it wasn't terrifically successful. On the other hand, our market economies have been very successful in creating products, but not successful in creating contented, happy, even concordant societies, because we now live in a world which is tearing itself apart in the West. And in part, this narrative of equality, plus the actuality of value production, or just commodity production, but the valuation of that, is creating this, where you start having a class that's saying, this inequality is because of this, and this group, white, male, this group, the in-group, we've got to take the resources away from them and give it to this group. There should be reparations, for example, for slavery, and so on. All of these are just terrible, in my opinion, terrible ideas, because they all gravitate, or what's the word? Gravitate. Orbit this idea, these fundamental ideas that of power, and that there is a way of distributing, as if power is something in and of itself, and power is kind of bound up with resources and offices, is the way John Rawls in his dreadful book, A Theory of Justice, put it, because he just sees the world as like everyone just wanting access to resources and offices. So this is a world in which our obligations are minimised, and yet we see in certain contexts they come out with a fury and a passion. People are criticising people because of not acting according to their obligations. So a new ethics evolves, but it's the ethics is really only ever also orbiting around these concepts of power and resources, and it's not enough to sustain a world. Our relationships are far more complex than that. The way we value is far more complex than that. Our value is not just demonstrated when we buy something. It's not just a market phenomenon. The love between parent and child, or between two people, is not a market relationship. Though it's interesting, isn't it? You hear, are you now on the market? That kind of language is even seeped into. So there is something, and I understand why Karl Marx wanted to do something against this, because he could see a sickness in it. He wasn't wrong, but the problem was he didn't have a solution. And we get back to the problem is that no matter what we do, there's always going to be something toxic that is part of what we do, and the best we can do is not get caught up in the abstractions that we deploy to study the phenomenon that is the problem. And the other thing is not to make false problems. So many problems now. I just watched a very, very good TV series in the writing. I think the writing was good. It was called The White Lotus. And it's about a group of people that go to stay in a resort in Hawaii. And what I thought was really good, especially the study of one family, where it was a college kid and her friend, who you weren't sure what she was, but she was not white. The friend was not bright white. You didn't know what her ethnicity was or whatever, but she was not white. And the mother was a CEO of some big corporation or something, and the husband did something or other. And they're all, they're all really screwed up. They're all lost. But the younger girls, they just, the various places they're reading Freud and Nietzsche and Lacan and colonialism, and they are brought out as a kind of cipher of the modern college student. And they're full of cliches. And of course, but they're the cliches that are in operation today. The writer hasn't dreamt up the cliches. It's exactly what comes out of their mouth. And I found it so sad because they're really tearing each other apart. And even the girls, at one bit, one of the girls turns against the other one and says, "You're not my friend," you know. And a lot of the discussion is about, you've had everything, you whites have been at the table, now it's our turn, and all of this. And you think, you know, whoever dreamt up the idea that life is just being at a table and what you have on your plate? That's so disgusting and so shocking. But it's become so commonplace, and our elite like to present the problem this way so that they can fix it. But of course they fix it by getting resources to do the fixing. So in their way, they're no better than someone selling bottle tops or beer. In fact, I think they're a lot worse, because at least I like beer. Certainly they're a lot worse than guitar makers who make such a great product, you know. But of course that they never really look at that aspect of it, because using this bewitching language in which equality is one of the pillars of this modern mental captivity. The other concept is emancipation, and that's going to be the subject of my next talk.